She never imagined Texas would smell like dust and wildflowers. Ayako pressed her face against the train window, watching the endless expanse of brown earth roll past. Beside her, 14 other Japanese women sat in tense silence, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes fixed on nothing. They were prisoners of war, being transported from California to a camp somewhere deep in Texas cattle country. The year was 1945, and everything Ayako had known about the world had already shattered twice. Once when her hospital unit was captured on Saipan, and again when the Americans treated them with unexpected decency instead of the brutality she'd been promised. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for what awaited in the small town of Hereford, Texas. The train lurched to a stop at a weathered station surrounded by vast open plains. Through the window, Ayako saw a group of American soldiers waiting, along with several civilians. One figure stood apart from the rest, a tall man in worn denim, a wide-brimmed hat shading his face, and boots that looked like they'd walked 1,000 miles. He leaned against a fence post with the ease of someone who belonged to this land, and as the prisoners filed off the train, his eyes met Ayako's for just a moment. She looked away quickly, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't understand. "Welcome to Hereford," an interpreter said in careful Japanese. "You'll be working at the agricultural station here. The work is honest, the treatment will be fair, and you'll be housed separately from the male prisoners. The people here are mostly ranchers and farmers. They're curious about you, but they've been told to treat you with respect." Respect. The word still felt foreign when applied to prisoners. The women were loaded into trucks and driven through town. Ayako watched in fascination as they passed storefronts with names like Miller's General Store and Hereford Cattle Company. Children playing in yards stopped to stare. Women hanging laundry paused mid-motion. This wasn't the America of bombs and battleships. This was something else entirely, a world that seemed untouched by war, where life continued in rhythms older than the conflict that had brought Ayako here. The camp itself was modest, a cluster of buildings surrounded by a low fence, more symbolic than restrictive. The barracks were clean, the beds equipped with mattresses and blankets. After months of military confinement, this almost felt like a farm, which, Ayako realized with growing confusion, was exactly what it was. The work began the next morning. The women were divided into groups and assigned to different tasks at the agricultural research station. Ayako, along with 4 others, was sent to help with crop irrigation and vegetable cultivation. Their supervisor was introduced simply as Jack. He was the cowboy from the station. Up close, Jack Brennan was weathered in the way only a lifetime under the Texas sun could achieve. His face was tanned and lined, his hands calloused from years of ranch work. He looked to be in his mid-30s, and when he spoke, his voice was slow and measured, with an accent that turned words into something almost musical. "Morning, ladies," he said, tipping his hat. The interpreter translated quickly. "We're going to be working the irrigation channels today. It's hot work, but honest. You do right by the land, and the land does right by you." Ayako watched him carefully as he demonstrated how to operate the irrigation gates, how to direct water flow, how to check soil moisture. His movements were efficient, practiced, almost reverent. He treated the earth like something precious, and when he knelt to examine a young tomato plant, his expression was gentle. "Your supervisor seems kind," whispered Tomoko, another prisoner working beside Ayako. "He's still the enemy," Ayako replied automatically, but even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. The first weeks established a routine. Wake at dawn, work until noon, break during the worst heat, resume until evening. The labor was demanding but not cruel. Jack never shouted, never raised his hand, never showed impatience when language barriers created confusion. Instead, he demonstrated, gestured, and occasionally drew pictures in the dirt to explain what he needed. Slowly, the women began to relax around him. They learned that he'd grown up on a ranch, that his family had worked this land for 3 generations, that he'd been exempt from military service because agricultural work was considered essential to the war effort. They learned that he was unmarried, married to the land, he joked through the interpreter, and that he treated his horses with the same patient kindness he showed the prisoners. Ayako found herself watching him more than was necessary. The way he moved through the fields with unconscious grace, the way he'd pause to watch the sunset, his expression distant and peaceful. The way he occasionally sang while working, low and off-key, songs about lonesome cowboys and endless prairies. She told herself it was simply fascination with this strange American world. She told herself it meant nothing. She was lying. The moment everything changed came on a scorching afternoon in July. Ayako had been working alone, adjusting an irrigation gate, when she heard an aggressive rattling sound. She froze, her blood turning cold. There, coiled less than 3 feet away, was a rattlesnake, thick-bodied and clearly agitated, its tail vibrating a deadly warning. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. Then Jack was there, appearing seemingly from nowhere. In one fluid motion, he stepped between Ayako and the snake, grabbed a shovel leaning against a fence post, and with 2 quick strikes, killed it. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but Ayako's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Jack turned to her, his face creased with concern. "You all right?" he asked. And for once, Ayako understood the English words without translation. She nodded, unable to speak. He studied her face, then did something unexpected. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, just for a moment, just to steady her. The touch was brief, appropriate, but it sent a shock through Ayako's entire body. Through the thin cotton of her work shirt, she could feel the warmth of his hand, the calluses, the strength tempered by gentleness. "Rattlers are common out here," he said, as the interpreter caught up to them. "You got to watch where you step, where you put your hands. I should have warned you better. That's my fault." His fault? He was apologizing to her? For not protecting a prisoner more carefully from local dangers? That evening, Ayako lay in her bunk, unable to sleep. She kept feeling that hand on her shoulder, kept seeing the way Jack had put himself between her and danger without hesitation. She thought about the stories she'd been told about Americans, that they were brutal, heartless, that they saw Japanese as subhuman. Yet this man had risked a venomous bite to protect her, and then apologized for not doing more. Nothing made sense anymore. The war, the propaganda, the neat categories of enemy and ally, all of it was crumbling in the face of one cowboy's simple decency. After the snake incident, something shifted between them. Jack seemed more attentive, checking on Ayako more frequently, making sure she had water during the hottest part of the day. His concern was subtle, never crossing professional lines, but Ayako felt it like a constant, warm presence. She began to study him more openly. She noticed that he always shared his lunch with the camp dogs, that he spoke to his horse like a friend, that he grew quiet and contemplative when storms rolled across the plains. She learned, through careful listening and the occasional translated conversation, that he'd lost his father 2 years earlier and now ran the family ranch alone. That he loved this land with a fierce, bone-deep devotion. That he was lonely, though he'd never say it directly. And slowly, terrifyingly, Ayako realized she was falling in love. The realization came one evening as she watched him repair a fence at sunset. The light turned everything golden, the grass, the wooden posts, his weathered face beneath the brim of his hat. He worked with focused attention, and there was something beautiful in his competence, in the way he fit so perfectly into this landscape. Ayako felt her chest tighten with a longing so intense it was almost painful. She wanted to walk over to him, to stand beside him in that golden light, to belong in this place the way he did. She wanted impossible things, a future that couldn't exist, a life on the other side of barbed wire and enemy lines. She was a prisoner. He was her captor. They were from worlds at war. And yet, here in the dust and wildflowers of Texas, none of that seemed to matter as much as the way her heart jumped when he smiled. The unspoken tension between them grew over the following months. They began to find excuses to work near each other. Jack started teaching Ayako English during breaks, pointing at objects and saying their names. Shovel, gate, sky, horse. Ayako repeated the words carefully, and Jack's face would light up when she got them right. One day he taught her his name, Not Jack, as she'd been calling him, but his full name, Jackson Lee Brennan. Jackson, Ayako repeated carefully. Jack, son. That's right, he said, and his smile was so genuine, so warm, that Ayako felt something crack open inside her chest. And you're Ayako. Ayako. Hearing her name in his accent, shaped by his Texas drawl, was one of the most intimate things she'd ever experienced. It meant he saw her, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as Ayako, a person, a woman, someone worthy of being known. Yes, she whispered. Ayako. The other women noticed, of course. Tomoko teased her gently. You watch him like a hawk watches a rabbit. I don't, Ayako protested. You do, and he watches you the same way, like you're both starving and afraid to reach for food. Ayako wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. The truth was written in every glance, every accidental brush of hands when passing tools, every moment of lingering eye contact that lasted just a second too long. But what could come of it? The war still raged. She was still a prisoner. He was still American. The world would never allow what her heart wanted. The breaking point came in September, during a violent thunderstorm. Ayako had been caught outside when the storm rolled in with shocking speed. Lightning cracked across the sky, rain poured in sheets, and the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. She was soaked within seconds, disoriented and frightened by the ferocity of the Texas weather. Then Jack was there again, materializing out of the rain. He grabbed her hand, no hesitation this time, no pretense of professional distance, and pulled her toward a nearby barn. They burst through the door and stood dripping in the dim interior, breathing hard, the storm raging outside. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Water dripped from Jack's hat. Ayako's hair was plastered to her face. The barn smelled of hay and horses, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like drums. Ayako, Jack said, and this time there was no interpreter, no translator, just her name in his mouth like a prayer. He stopped, struggling with words, or perhaps struggling with the enormity of what those words would mean. Ayako understood. She understood perfectly, because she felt the same impossible thing. Jackson, she said softly, and she saw his expression shift, saw the careful control crack just slightly. This is crazy, he said, more to himself than to her. We can't. But he didn't step away, and neither did she. The storm raged for an hour, and they spent it in that barn, sitting on hay bales, not touching but close enough that the space between them felt electric. Jack tried to explain his feelings in simple English, and Ayako responded in broken phrases, and together they pieced together a conversation about impossible things. When war over, Ayako said carefully, I go Japan. I know, Jack replied. You stay Texas. I know. So, no future. Jack was quiet for a long time. Rain drummed on the roof. Finally, he said, Doesn't make it not real, does it? What we feel. It's still real, even if there's no future in it. Ayako didn't have the English to respond, but she nodded. Yes, it was real. This impossible, impractical, war-crossed feeling was the most real thing she'd experienced in years. When the storm passed and they emerged from the barn, something had fundamentally changed. They didn't touch, didn't make promises they couldn't keep, but they had acknowledged the truth. And there was a strange peace in that acknowledgement, even knowing it led nowhere. The weeks that followed were bittersweet. Jack and Ayako continued their work together, continued their quiet English lessons, continued to exist in the small bubble of time they'd carved out. They knew it couldn't last. News of the war filtered in, rumors of massive bombings, whispers that Japan was near defeat. Then, in August, came word of Hiroshima, of Nagasaki, of surrender. The war was over. The prisoners learned they would be repatriated soon, sent back to a Japan that no longer existed in the form they remembered. The women in Ayako's barracks reacted with a mixture of relief, grief, and fear. They were going home, but what home remained? Ayako felt numb. She should have been happy. The war was over. She'd survived. She could return to whatever remained of her family, rebuild her life, find her place in a new Japan. Instead, all she could think about was that she would never see Jackson Lee Brennan again, never work beside him in the Texas heat, never hear him say her name in that slow, careful way. On her last day at the agricultural station, Jack found her alone in the vegetable garden they'd tended together. The tomatoes were ripe, heavy on the vines. It had been a good harvest. "Ayako," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion he was trying to control. "I want you to know what you made me understand this year." He stopped, searching for words. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a small object wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her carefully. Ayako unwrapped it and found a simple silver bracelet, delicate and clearly old. "My mother's," Jack explained. "She passed when I was young. I'd want you to have it. Something to remember on this time. To remember that even in war, even across enemy lines, people can still see each other. Really see each other." Tears burned Ayako's eyes. She wanted to refuse. It was too precious, too meaningful. But she also wanted to accept, wanted this tangible piece of him to carry home. "I cannot give you anything," she whispered in English. "You already have," Jack said simply. "You reminded me what it means to care about someone, to feel alive. That's enough. That's more than enough." They stood in the garden, surrounded by the evidence of their shared labor, and allowed themselves one moment of absolute honesty. If the world were different, if war hadn't divided them, if circumstances were anything other than what they were, maybe they could have built something beautiful together. But the world was what it was. "Thank you," Ayako said, closing her hand around the bracelet, "for seeing me, for treating me like person." "You are a person," Jack said fiercely. "You always were. The war doesn't change that. Nothing changes that." The train that took Ayako away from Texas was crowded with repatriated prisoners, all heading to California and then to ships that would carry them across the Pacific. She sat by the window, watching the landscape change, watching Texas disappear behind her. The bracelet was cool against her wrist, hidden beneath her sleeve. She touched it constantly, reassuring herself it was real, that everything that had happened was real. Tomoko sat beside her, silent for once. Finally, she said quietly, "You loved him." It wasn't a question. Ayako nodded anyway. "Yes." "Does he know?" "Yes." "And?" "And nothing. The war is over. We are enemies who became something else, but now we return to being strangers." "That seems cruel," Tomoko said. "Yes," Ayako agreed, "but the war was cruel. This is just another casualty." Ayako returned to a devastated Japan. Her family home was gone, her father dead, her mother living with relatives in Kyoto. She found work as a nurse in a hospital overwhelmed with the wounded and sick. Life was hard, resources scarce, the future uncertain. But at night, she would touch the bracelet on her wrist and remember Texas. Remember dust and wildflowers. Remember a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat who had treated her with dignity when the world said she deserved none. Remember that in the middle of humanity's greatest conflict, two people from opposite sides had found something real and true. Letters were impossible. Prisoners of war had no addresses to exchange, no way to maintain contact across enemy lines. Even if they could have written, what would they say? The war that had brought them together had also ensured they could never be together. Years passed. Japan rebuilt. Ayako married a good man, a doctor who was kind if not passionate. She had children, built a life, found a measure of peace. But she never took off the bracelet, and she never stopped wondering what became of Jackson Lee Brennan.